The first thing he noticed was the porch light, flickering faintly like it couldn't decide if it wanted to shine or give up completely. A little girl stood barefoot in the doorway, clutching a ragged grey rabbit. And before Jonas could speak, she whispered something so soft, so strange it made his chest tighten. "If I talk, Mama will disappear." If this moment already has you leaning closer, take a second to like this video and subscribe. Here we share quiet stories about hope, healing, and the people who stay, even when it's hard. The sound of rain against the cracked windshield felt almost gentle, as if the storm itself was afraid to disturb him. Jonas sat in his old pickup truck, engine off, hands resting on the steering wheel. The wipers had stopped halfway across the glass, frozen like they were holding their breath. He stared out at nothing, his coffee gone cold in the cup holder. His phone buzzed on the seat beside him. He didn't move at first. Then, with a sigh that felt too heavy for his chest, he picked it up. "Jonas?" The voice was warm but tense, a voice he hadn't heard in years. "Linda," he said. "It's been a while." "It has." A pause. "I wouldn't be calling if it wasn't important. Is anyone hurt?" His tone sharpened like a blade. "No, not like that. It's a favor for an old friend." Jonas exhaled, leaning back. "Linda, I'm not that man anymore." "I know," she said softly. "But she doesn't need that man. She needs someone who listens, someone who knows how to stay." He stayed quiet. Linda continued. "Her name is Elena Cross. She's complicated, CEO, wealthy, too proud for her own good. She doesn't want a nanny, she wants a driver. Someone who can watch her daughter at night without asking questions, a stranger in her house. She said she prefers someone who won't get involved. You have a quiet way about you, Jonas. That's why I thought of you." "I haven't worked in years." "You've been driving, haven't you, for yourself, for Toby?" At the mention of his son's name, something in Jonas's face flickered. "Where is this?" he asked finally. "I've sent you the address. It's 10 miles out." "Jonas, please." He looked down at the phone screen, rain dripping onto his sleeve from a cracked window. "I'll go," he said, almost to himself. "But only for tonight." "Thank you." Linda's voice broke slightly before she hung up. Jonas tossed the phone onto the seat. He turned the key and the truck rumbled to life. The rain picked up, drumming harder against the glass as he pulled out onto the road, headed toward a house he had no reason to enter, and no idea he would never forget. The tires hummed against the wet asphalt as Jonas drove through winding back roads. The rain blurred the world outside into streaks of grey and silver. Even the streetlights seemed reluctant to shine too brightly. His old pickup smelled faintly of coffee and damp leather. The heater sputtered as he rubbed his thumb across the steering wheel. Ahead, the GPS screen glowed dimly, an arrow pointing to a destination he couldn't picture. He passed through a quiet stretch of forest where tree branches arched over the road like somber sentinels. For a moment, the darkness pressed in, so tightly it felt like the world had folded in on itself. Then, as he rounded a bend, he saw it. The Cross estate stood on a hill, partially hidden by wrought iron gates and towering oaks. The house was massive, white stone walls, a long veranda, windows lined with soft golden light. But there was something about it that didn't feel welcoming. Jonas slowed as the gates opened with a mechanical whir. He eased the truck forward, tires crunching over the gravel drive. At the top of the steps, a single porch light glowed. It wasn't warm like the kitchen lights of a home. It was sharp and pale, casting long shadows across the marble columns. Jonas parked and killed the engine. For a moment, there was only the sound of rain tapping on the roof of the cab. He stayed still, watching the house through the windshield. The light above the door flickered once, then steadied again. He wasn't sure why, but the sight made his chest tighten. Jonas pulled his hood up, grabbed his worn leather satchel from the passenger seat and stepped out into the downpour. The air was cold and smelled faintly of wet earth and old stone. As he approached the steps, the front door creaked open. A figure stood there in the doorway, perfectly still. The woman in the doorway looked like she had been carved out of the cold night air itself. Elena Cross, late 30s. Dark hair pulled back into a severe knot. Tailored blazer, crisp white shirt, not a wrinkle in sight. Even in the dim porch light, her presence was sharp enough to cut. "You're Jonas?" she asked. Her voice was low but precise, with no trace of warmth. "Yes," he said, adjusting the strap of his satchel. "Linda sent me." She gave a slight nod. "Linda says you're discreet. I need someone who can drive me to and from meetings and wait here in the evenings. No questions, no interference." Jonas held her gaze, unflinching. "Understood. Good." She stepped aside and he followed her into the foyer. The house smelled faintly of polished wood and faint lavender, but there was no softness in. "Kate, her name is Emma," Elena said as she set her keys on a marble table. 6 years old. She doesn't speak much. Best not to press her." Before Jonas could respond, a small sound drew his attention upward. At the top of the wide staircase, a little girl stood barefoot on the landing. Her hair was slightly mussed, and in her arms she clutched a grey rabbit toy so tightly its ears drooped limply. Jonas softened his voice. "Hey there." Emma didn't reply. She didn't even look at him. "She doesn't like strangers talking to her," Elena said matter-of-factly, though there was no unkindness in her tone. Jonas nodded slightly. "I understand." As Eleanor turned away toward another room, Jonas caught a glimpse of Emma bringing the rabbit close to her face. She whispered something into its ragged ear, so soft it was swallowed by the cavernous silence of the house. But, even without hearing the words, Jonas felt the weight of them settle in his chest. A child who speaks only to a toy isn't just shy, she's hiding. The kitchen was silent, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of old pipes. Jonas moved carefully, setting a pot of water to boil. His hands knew these motions too well, chopping vegetables, stirring broth, waiting for warmth to spread through the air. Across the room, Emma sat at the edge of a wooden chair, her small frame barely disturbing the space around her. She didn't swing her legs or fiddle with the rabbit in her lap. She just sat, eyes fixed on the tiled floor, as if looking up might draw attention she didn't want. Jonas glanced over, offering the barest hint of a smile. "You hungry?" Emma didn't answer. He didn't press. Instead, he moved to switch on the overhead light. The moment his hand touched the switch, she flinched, so subtly most people wouldn't notice. But Jonas did. He paused. Then he turned and opened a drawer, pulling out a small lamp. The soft yellow glow pooled gently across the counter, chasing away the kitchen's shadows, without the harshness of the ceiling light. Emma didn't move, but her shoulders loosened ever so slightly. Jonas returned to his cooking, letting the quiet settle. He remembered nights like this years ago when Toby stopped speaking after the accident. He had learned back then some silences weren't meant to be broken. They were meant to be shared. A faint sound drew his attention. Emma had slid down from her chair and was now crouched beneath the table, her arms wrapped tight around the grey rabbit. Not hiding from him, Jonas realized, hiding from the light. He set the spoon down gently and crouched so his voice wouldn't carry far. "It's okay down there," he said softly. "Take all the time you need." Emma didn't respond, but her fingers clutched the rabbit tighter. Jonas stayed crouched a moment longer before standing and returning to the stove, keeping the lamp's glow low and warm. The smell of simmering broth filled the kitchen, but Jonas wasn't really there anymore. His hands stirred the pot out of habit, but his mind had slipped backward to a winter 3 years ago. He saw Toby, 6 years old then, curled up on a hospital bed far too big for his small frame. The boy's wide brown eyes stared at the ceiling, unblinking, as if sound itself had been stolen from the world. Jonas remembered the sterile white walls, the steady beep of machines, the silence heavier than any battlefield he'd ever known. After the accident, after they pulled the car from the river, Toby hadn't spoken for 57 days, not a word. Doctors called it selective mutism, a response to trauma. They said to be patient, to wait, to keep the routine steady. But waiting felt like drowning. Jonas remembered sitting outside Toby's room night after night, back pressed to the door, whispering stories through the wood. Stories about nights, and stars and rabbits who never stopped listening. He never knew if Toby heard him. Then one morning, as he placed pancakes on the table, Toby whispered his first words in nearly 2 months. "Do angels cry when no one's watching?" Jonas had stood frozen, spatula still in hand because he didn't know if he was allowed to breathe yet. The memory pulled him back into the kitchen of the Cross estate. Jonas blinked, realizing his hand had stopped stirring. He tightened his grip on the wooden spoon and let out a slow breath. Emma's silence wasn't the same as Toby's, but he knew the look in her eyes. A child doesn't stop speaking without a reason. The house had gone still. Jonas sat in the dim light of a lamp, an old paperback resting on his knee, though his eyes hadn't moved past the same sentence in 20 minutes. Somewhere above, a faint creak echoed through the wooden beams. He set the book aside. The clock on the wall ticked softly, its hands hovering near midnight as Jonas rose and padded barefoot across the kitchen tiles. The house smelled faintly of lavender and rain-soaked earth drifting in through a cracked window. Then he heard it. A whisper, so soft it could have been the house settling. Jonas followed the sound down the hallway to the base of the staircase. He paused, listening. Another whisper, this time clearer. "Don't let me speak. Please, if I speak, she'll disappear." The voice was small and trembling. Jonas tilted his head, catching a sliver of light spilling from an open bedroom door upstairs. Quietly, he climbed. At the threshold, he stopped. Emma sat cross-legged on the carpet, the grey rabbit cradled close to her face. She rocked slightly, her lips moving against the toy's tattered ear. "Don't let me say it," she breathed into the rabbit. "If I talk, she'll leave like he did." Jonas didn't move, didn't speak. The slightest creak of the floorboard might shatter this fragile moment. He watched as Emma pulled the rabbit tighter, her small fingers clutching its threadbare seams like they were her last anchor to the world. Lump formed in Jonas's throat. This wasn't just a quiet child. This was a child holding back words as if they were dangerous. He stepped back into the hallway, careful not to disturb the silence. Some stories don't start with shouting, Jonas thought. The worst ones begin with whispers. The rabbit's ear hung by a single thread, dangling like a flag in the wind. Jonas sat at the kitchen table, the house around him hushed and heavy. A small sewing kit lay open beside his calloused hands. The needle gleamed faintly under the soft lamplight. He hadn't sewn anything in years, not since Toby's favourite stuffed fox lost an arm, and he spent an entire night trying to fix it, his fingers clumsy but determined. Now, with the same careful patience, he pushed the needle through the worn fabric of the rabbit's ear. In and out, tiny stitches, steady and invisible, like they'd always been there. Upstairs, the faintest sound of Emma shifting in her bed reached his ears. He paused, waiting for silence to settle again before tying the final knot. The rabbit looked whole now, still old and frayed, but whole in the way that mattered. Jonas held it for a moment longer, thumb brushing the faded grey fur. He thought of how tightly Emma had clung to it, as if the little toy was her last defense against a world too bright, too loud. Carefully, he rose and climbed the stairs. Her door was ajar, the faint glow of her nightlight spilling across the hallway. Jonas eased inside. Emma slept curled on her side, arms folded close to her chest. In the dim light, her small face looked peaceful but fragile, like a porcelain figure too thin to touch. He knelt by her bed, set the rabbit gently into the crook of her arm. "Stay with her," he whispered to the toy. Then he stood, backing out, slowly, and closed the door until only a sliver of light remained. Morning came soft and pale, creeping through half-drawn curtains. Jonas stood by the kitchen counter, hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug. The scent of brewing coffee filled the air, grounding him in the quiet. Upstairs, a faint creak of floorboards caught his attention. He didn't move, just listened. Minutes passed before Emma appeared in the doorway, her small frame half hidden behind the edge of the wall. She still wore her nightdress, one sleeve slipping off her shoulder. In her arms the grey rabbit dangled, ear stitched neatly back in place. She wasn't clutching it as tightly this time. Jonas kept his voice low, careful. "Morning." Emma didn't answer, but she didn't retreat either. Instead, her fingers brushed the rabbit's repaired ear, tracing the new stitches. Her thumb lingered there for a moment before she glanced up at him. It wasn't a long look, barely more than a flicker. But in that flicker, Jonas saw something shift, not trust, not yet, but curiosity. He nodded once, as if to say he noticed, but asked nothing more. Emma moved to the table and sat, placing the rabbit on her lap. Her small hands smoothed its fur absent-mindedly. Jonas set a plate of toast down in front of her. She didn't touch it, but her eyes followed his movements with quiet intent. He didn't try to fill the silence. He had learned with Toby that some silences aren't empty. Some are seeds waiting for the right moment to break open. The front door opened with a click. Jonas didn't move from his spot by the kitchen counter, though his shoulders tensed. The quiet rhythm of rain on the windows barely masked the sound of high heels on polished floors. Elena Cross entered like a storm disguised as sunlight. Her coat was impeccable, her hair pulled tight into a knot that didn't dare loosen. She stopped at the threshold, dark eyes sweeping the room like a hawk scanning for weakness. Jonas met her gaze calmly. "Miss Cross," he said with a slight nod. Elena's eyes flicked to the small figure at the table. Emma sat perfectly still, her fingers brushing the repaired ear of her rabbit. For the first time in days, she wasn't hiding under the table or retreating into shadows. Elena's jaw tightened. "I asked you to drive," she said coolly, "not to involve yourself." Jonas didn't flinch. "She came to the kitchen. I made breakfast." "Children are creatures of habit," Elena replied sharply. "You'll confuse her." "She's already confused," Jonas said evenly. "Confused why the only place she feels safe is under a table." The air between them stretched taut. "I hired you because Linda assured me you know how to stay in your lane," Elena said. Her voice clipped. "I do," Jonas replied, "but someone has to watch the road." For a moment, Elena's mask cracked, just slightly. Then her posture stiffened again, her expression cooling like marble. "You may leave for the day," she said. "I won't require your services tonight." Jonas didn't argue. He glanced once at Emma, who was watching him quietly, her thumb still stroking the rabbit's ear. Then he gathered his coat and stepped out into the rain, the door closing with a soft but final click behind him. The house was quiet again. Jonas sat cross-legged on the kitchen floor, an unlit paper, lantern resting in his hands. The soft rice paper felt fragile, like a thing that could tear under the weight of a careless breath. He'd found it tucked in a dusty corner cabinet earlier that evening, long forgotten. Upstairs, Emma moved faintly in her room. Jonas could hear her pacing, the sound barely more than a whisper of feet against wood. He thought back to the first night she'd flinched at the ceiling light, how her small frame had folded inward, as if the brightness might burn her skin. Some children feared the dark, Emma feared the light. Jonas placed the lantern on the floor and attached the small, battery-operated bulb. A warm, amber glow bloomed. Gently inside, soft as candlelight but without the harsh edges. He carried it upstairs. Emma's door was ajar. He tapped lightly. "It's me," he said softly. There was no reply, but he pushed the door open anyway. Emma sat on her bed, knees pulled to her chest, the grey rabbit in her lap. Jonas crouched, holding out the lantern like an offering. "Too bright?" he asked. Emma's wide eyes flicked to the glowing orb. She didn't speak, but her grip on the rabbit loosened slightly. "It's soft," Jonas said, "like moonlight. No need to hide from this one." He set the lantern on her nightstand. Its warm light spilled gently across the room, pushing shadows into the corners without chasing them away completely. Emma didn't move, but her shoulders dropped by an inch. Jonas didn't smile, didn't speak again. He simply stood and left. Her door opened a crack as he walked out, letting the amber glow linger behind him. The lantern's glow pulsed softly in the quiet room, like a heartbeat. Emma sat on the edge of her bed, rabbit in hand. Her bare toes brushed the wooden floor as she shifted slightly, her gaze fixed on the paper lantern glowing a few feet away. She didn't hide this time. Jonas watched from the doorway, careful not to step inside. His presence was a shadow, steady, but distant. Emma's fingers stroked the rabbit's stitched ear. Then slowly she whispered something to it. "Do you think the light will stay soft?" Jonas couldn't hear the words, but he saw the way her shoulders softened. His phone vibrated. In his pocket. He slipped out into the hallway to answer, his voice low. "Hey, bud." Toby's voice crackled faintly on the other end. "Hi, Dad." Jonas smiled faintly, leaning against the wall. "How's your evening?" "Okay. I had a dream." "Yeah? What about?" Toby's voice dropped, almost shy. "I dreamed of Mom. She was smiling." Jonas closed his eyes. His fingers tightened around the phone, the ache in his chest sharp but not cruel. "That's a good dream," he said gently. "Do you think she's happy wherever she is?" Jonas drew in a slow breath. "I think she smiles every time she sees you being brave." There was a pause. Then Toby whispered, "I miss her." "I know," Jonas said, voice rough around the edges. "I miss her too." In the room behind him, the glow of the lantern spilled softly across the hall, and for the first time Jonas wondered if maybe, just maybe, Emma was dreaming of someone smiling too. The room was too bright. Elena stood before the full-length mirror in her private dressing room, hands gripping the edge of the marble counter. A vanity light glared above her, spilling harsh white beams across her face. The reflection staring back seemed foreign. Eyes too sharp, jaw too tight. A woman sculpted from discipline and sleepless nights. She didn't blink. "Mama hated the dark," she whispered to her own reflection. "She kept the lights on all night." Her voice cracked faintly. "But I was the one afraid of light." The memory came uninvited. A little girl curled beneath a blanket, flinching every time the hallway light flickered. Shadows would dance on her bedroom walls like claws, and Mama's voice, sharp, impatient, would hiss through the door. "Don't be ridiculous. Only weak children fear the light." Eleanor exhaled slowly. She had learned to sit still to keep her breathing quiet, to let the glow burn her eyes until they watered. Over time, the fear had hardened into something else, control, power. But now, seeing Emma flinch at the brightness of a simple kitchen bulb, she wondered if she'd pass that same shadow on to her daughter. Elena touched the mirror lightly, her fingers trembling. "Am I burning her too?" she whispered. In the hallway beyond, faint golden light from Emma's lantern glowed against the floorboards. Elena shut her eyes, gripping the counter tighter, as if she could hold herself together a little longer. The garden was still damp from last night's rain. Jonas crouched near a patch of rosemary, pulling at the weeds with slow, deliberate hands. The air smelled of wet earth and faint lavender drifting from the house. A soft sound made him glance up. Emma stood a few feet away, rabbit clutched tight in one arm, a folded piece of paper in the other. She didn't speak. Instead, she held out the paper, her fingers trembling slightly. Jonas wiped his hands on his jeans before taking it. He unfolded the sheet carefully. A child's drawing. Thick crayon lines filled the page. A house with long windows spilling harsh yellow light. A small figure crouched in a corner, and another towering shape in the center, its head haloed with bright jagged rays. The figure in the corner held a tiny rabbit. Jonas studied the picture for a long moment. "This is your house?" he asked softly. Emma nodded. "And her?" He pointed to the tall figure with the jagged light. Emma's lips parted, but no sound came. Her free hand touched the rabbit's stitched ear, as if borrowing its strength. "She gets too bright," she whispered finally. Jonas felt something tighten in his chest. "Too bright?" he echoed. Emma nodded again. "When she's sad, or mad, the light hurts." Jonas folded the paper carefully, like it was made of glass. "Thank you for showing me," he said gently. Emma's eyes flicked up just for a second, meeting his. There was no fear in them this time, only a fragile, searching trust. The folded drawing still sat in Jonas's palm, its crayon lines smudging faintly against his skin. He crouched lower in the garden, keeping his voice soft. "You know," he said gently, "when I was little, I thought if I made too much noise my dad would leave, so I stayed quiet, for a long time." Emma didn't look at him. Her fingers fidgeted with the rabbit's frayed ear, tugging the loose threads. "But one day," Jonas continued, "I realized it wasn't my noise that made him go, it was his choice." Silence. Emma's lips moved. just barely, as if she were testing a thought against her own breath. If I talk, she whispered, she'll disappear. Jonas felt the words hit him like a slow wave. Who'll disappear? He asked softly, though he already knew. Mama, Emma's voice cracked on the last syllable. Her small shoulders hunched forward as if to shield herself from something invisible. Jonas let out a slow breath, anchoring himself in the quiet. It's not your words that make people stay or go, he said after a moment. Your voice isn't magic like that. Emma blinked rapidly, fighting back something she didn't know how to name. But she didn't run. She stayed, the lantern light from her bedroom still glowing faintly through the open window. The study smelled faintly of smoke and old paper. Jonas stood by the doorway, one hand gripping the frame, watching as Elena struck a match. The flame hissed to life, its light reflecting in her sharp eyes. On the desk lay an envelope, yellowed, edges frayed. A letter from long ago. Elena, Jonas said softly. Don't. She didn't look at him. It's just paper, she murmured. Paper doesn't bleed. But her hands trembled as she held the corner of the letter over the flame. Emma's afraid of you, Jonas said. His voice was low, steady. Not because you're cruel, because she feels the weight you're carrying, and she thinks she's the reason it's so heavy. Eleanor's jaw tightened. She's not, Jonas continued. She's just a little girl trying not to break you. The letter caught fire, edges curling black. Elena let it burn. My mother, she whispered, eyes locked on the flames. She left scars you can't see. And every time Emma looks at me with those big, quiet eyes, I see her. I see her. Jonas stepped closer, but didn't reach for her. Then be the one who ends it, he said gently. Don't pass her silence along like an heirloom. The fire sputtered, consuming the last of the letter. Eleanor let the ashes fall into the crystal tray, her shoulders stiff. You're a driver, she said coldly. Not a therapist? Maybe, Jonas replied evenly. But I know when a child's silence isn't peace, it's survival. For a moment, Elena's mask slipped, just enough for Jonas to see the fear behind her steel gaze. The lantern's warm glow filled the room, casting soft amber circles on the walls. Emma sat cross-legged on the carpet, crayons scattered around her like fallen petals. The grey rabbit rested in her lap, one ear stitched with careful, clumsy hands. Jonas knelt a few feet away, watching in silence. On the paper before her, Emma had drawn two figures, a tall one and a small one standing under a golden light. Above them, in shaky block letters, she had written, Safe. Her hand hovered over the page, as if she wasn't sure whether to add more. Jonas spoke softly. That's a beautiful drawing. Emma didn't respond, but her shoulders didn't tense this time. He waited. Then, barely audible, a word slipped from her lips. Mama. The sound was fragile, as if her voice had been locked away for so long it forgot how to move. Jonas froze, the word sinking deep into the quiet. Emma's fingers tightened around the rabbit. Her eyes glistened, but she didn't look up. Mama, she whispered again, this time stronger. Jonas felt a knot in his throat. He didn't speak, didn't dare break the spell. He simply let the silence wrap around them like a blanket, soft, safe, and whole. Jonas stood in the hallway, one shoulder resting against the cool wall. Through the slightly ajar door he could hear faint murmurs, Emma's small voice, halting and unsure, and Elena's quiet sobs threading through the stillness. He didn't step closer. Some moments weren't meant to be witnessed. Jonas's hand slipped into his pocket, fingers brushing against a soft piece of cloth. He pulled it out, a small, faded handkerchief, edges embroidered with uneven stitches. Toby's gift. The boy had given it to him months ago, after Jonas dropped him off at his first sleepover. You get lonely too, right? Toby had asked, peering up with solemn eyes. Jonas had laughed softly. Sometimes. Then keep this, Toby said, pressing the little square into his father's palm. It's my magic cloth. It makes people smile. Jonas rubbed the fabric between his fingers now, the stitches catching faintly. Don't forget to smile, Dad, Toby's voice echoed in his memory. even if it's just a small one. The sound of Emma whispering "Mama" drifted out again, fragile but steady this time. Jonas closed his eyes. He smiled. Not a wide grin, but the kind that came from somewhere deep, a quiet promise to keep showing up, even when the road ahead felt impossible. The dining room felt warmer than Jonas remembered, not because of the fire. Crackling faintly in the hearth or the golden glow of the paper lantern Eleanor had brought from Emma's room, but because of something quieter, like the air itself had softened. The long oak table, polished to a dull shine, bore 3 simple plates of roasted vegetables and warm bread. Jonas sat at one end, Eleanor at the other. Emma perched between them, her small frame barely denting the chair cushion. She held her rabbit gently, stroking its stitched ear. Then, without a word, she set it down carefully next to the lantern in the center of the table. The soft amber light bathed the grey fur, making it look almost golden. Jonas watched the gesture with quiet awe. Elena noticed too, her hands stilled on her fork. For a moment she looked like she might say something, but didn't. Instead, she let out a breath as if releasing something heavy she had been carrying for too long. The 3 of them ate slowly. No one rushed. The only sounds were the clink of cutlery and the soft hum of rain tapping the window pane. For Jonas, it felt like standing at the edge of a long, hard winter and seeing the first crocus bloom through the snow, small, fragile, but alive. The garden was quiet under the early evening sky. Elena stood near the stone bench, arms wrapped tightly around herself. Her silk blouse clung slightly to her shoulders in the damp air, but she didn't seem to notice. Jonas stood a few steps behind, hands in his coat pockets. He didn't speak. He'd learned with people like her that silence often pulled more truth than questions ever could. Eleanor's gaze was fixed on the lantern Jonas had left hanging from a low branch. Its warm glow spilled over the grass, softening the hard edges of the night. "My mother," Eleanor began, her voice barely above a whisper. "She didn't teach me to love. She taught me to survive, to endure." Jonas's breath left in a slow, steady stream. "I thought if I could build a fortress around myself, nothing would get in. No pain, no memories." She swallowed hard, her eyes glinting faintly in the lantern light. "But now there's Emma, and she's so small, so quiet, and I don't know how to give her what I never had." Jonas stepped closer, stopping just short of touching her shoulder. "Maybe you don't need to know right now," he said softly. "Maybe you just need to stay, even when it's hard." Eleanor let out a brittle laugh, though her eyes were wet. "I don't know how to stay either. I've only ever known how to keep moving." "Then start here," Jonas replied gently, his voice steady as the lantern glow. Jonas's hands tightened slightly in his coat pockets. The lantern's glow wavered as a breeze swept through the garden, casting shifting shadows across the stone path. "When my wife died," he began, his voice low. "Our son, Toby, he stopped speaking for months." Eleanor turned her head slightly, her brow furrowing. "I thought I was doing everything right," Jonas continued. "Meals on time, a clean house. I read all the books about grief, about parenting through loss. But every night, he'd just sit there, staring at the wall, and I couldn't reach him." He let out a slow breath. "One night I asked him why he wouldn't talk to me, and he whispered, 'Because if I tell you I'm sad, you might leave too.'" The words hung in the air, heavy and raw. "I realized then," Jonas said, "love isn't about never hurting each other. That's impossible." Elena's arms tightened around her frame, as though bracing against a truth she didn't want but needed to hear. "Love is staying," Jonas said softly. "Staying when it's ugly, when it's inconvenient, when you don't know if you're doing it right." Elena's eyes glistened in the faint light. "And if I fail?" she asked, her voice fragile. "You will," Jonas said gently. "We all do. But if you're still there, still trying, that's what she'll remember." The room smelled faintly of lavender and rain-soaked air. Elena sat on the edge of Emma's bed, her posture stiff, hands folded tightly in her lap. It had been years, maybe forever, since she'd allowed herself to simply sit like this, quiet and unguarded next to her daughter. Emma lay curled under the blanket, the grey rabbit pressed to her chest. The lantern on the nightstand glowed softly, casting a warm halo across her small face. Elena took a slow breath. "I don't know if—" "I'm doing this right," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. "But I'm here. I'm still here." For a long moment the only sound was the faint hum of the night outside. Then Emma's lips parted, her voice barely a thread of sound. "Mama." Elena's heart lurched. Emma's tiny fingers tightened. Around the rabbit's stitched ear. "Mama, don't disappear again." The words were fragile, almost breaking under their own weight. Elena's throat burned. She reached out, hesitant, trembling, and laid her hand over Emma's small one. "I won't," she whispered. "Not this time." Emma's eyes fluttered closed, but her fingers didn't let go. For the first time in years, Elena stayed. The air smelled of wet grass and brewed coffee. Jonas zipped his duffel bag slowly, the sound harsh in the morning quiet. Through the window he saw Elena and Emma moving around the kitchen. Elena was cracking eggs into a bowl, her movement still precise but softer somehow. Emma sat at the table, small hands resting near a steaming mug of cocoa. For the first time since he arrived, they didn't seem to need him. Jonas slung the bag over his shoulder and stepped quietly toward the front door. His boots made the faintest creak on the old floorboards, but before his hand reached the knob, a patter of footsteps came from behind. "Jonas!" He turned just as Emma burst into the hall, breathless. She clutched her grey rabbit tight against her chest. Without a word, she pressed it into his hands. "Safe should go with you," she said, voice small but steady. Jonas froze, staring at the patched-up toy in his palms. "Why?" he asked softly. Emma's eyes glistened. "Because you kept me safe. Now he can keep you safe too." Jonas felt his throat tighten. He knelt down, bringing himself level with her gaze. "Emma." "I'm not going far," he said gently, but her little hands pushed the rabbit closer. "Take him, please." The kitchen smelled of warm bread and cinnamon. Jonas stood in the doorway, duffel bag still slung over his shoulder. Emma had gone back to her seat, cocoa in hand, but her rabbit was missing, its grey ears now peeking from Jonas's coat pocket. Elena glanced up from the skillet. Their eyes met. "You're leaving," she said quietly. Jonas shifted his weight, unsure how to answer. Elena turned off the burner. The room fell into a hush, broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator. "You didn't just drive us around or cook dinners," she said softly. You taught us something we didn't know we needed." Jonas frowned slightly. Elena's fingers brushed a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "You taught Emma that the world doesn't have to stay dark forever," she continued. "And you taught me—" Her voice faltered. She took a breath, steadying herself. "You taught me how to turn the lights on, when it matters." Jonas felt a warmth spread in his chest, deeper than anything he could put into words. "Thank you," Elena said, her voice firmer now, "for staying, even when it wasn't easy." Emma looked up from her cocoa, her small hand resting over the empty space where her rabbit had been. "Stay for breakfast?" she asked softly. Jonas smiled, the kind of smile that felt like sunlight after a long winter. "I'd like that," he said. The truck engine rumbled low as Jonas parked at the edge of the long gravel driveway. Through the windshield, he could see the house bathed in a soft golden glow. The porch light was on, not harsh or blinding this time, but warm, steady. He rested his hands on the steering wheel for a moment, watching as two small shadows moved past the kitchen window. Emma and Elena. Their laughter, quiet, hesitant, floated faintly into the night air. Jonas reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the grey rabbit. His thumb traced the stitched ear, the one he'd patched the first night he'd felt something. "Shift in this house. Looks like we both made it," he murmured. The rabbit's worn fur caught the dim light from the dashboard. Jonas let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "We've done our mending," he whispered. "You, me, all of us." For a brief second he thought about driving away, back to his quiet apartment, his routines, his own silence. But then Emma's small voice echoed in his memory. "Don't go," and Eleanor's softer one. "You taught us how to turn the lights on." Jonas smiled. Not wide, not forced, but the kind of smile that starts in the chest and moves outward like a ripple. He turned off the engine, stepped out into the cool night air, and walked slowly toward the house. The porch light didn't flicker. It stayed bright, waiting. Jonas stood at the edge of the driveway, watching the porch light glow steady and warm. Inside, Emma was laughing, really laughing this time, her small hands tracing constellations on the foggy window. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the grey rabbit, its stitched ear frayed from countless nights of being held tight. With a soft smile, Jonas whispered to himself, "We've all been patched up now. Even me." The house didn't just look like a home anymore. Fad felt like one, and for the first time in years he didn't feel like an outsider looking in. If this story stayed with you, take a quiet moment to like this video and subscribe. Here, we share stories about healing, hope, and the quiet courage it takes to stay when staying matters most.